Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the invisible jobs that kept ancient empires running. Those everyday, often overlooked roles that made history happen. It's easy to imagine the grand battles, majestic rulers, and powerful gods of the ancient world, but the real engine behind these empires? It was the quiet work of countless people who never made it into the history books. You probably won't survive this journey if you find yourself among these unsung heroes, but hey, they didn't, so there's that. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and feel free to share where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. I'm genuinely curious. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin by talking about those behind-the-scenes workers who made empires possible. While we often focus on the grandeur of ancient civilizations, the towering pyramids, the incredible feats of engineering, and the larger-than-life personalities who led them, there was a crucial, invisible workforce that held everything together. These workers didn't seek glory, but their contributions were integral to the success of ancient societies. For every monumental achievement in the ancient world, there was an unseen army of labourers, artisans, farmers, and scribes making it happen. Take, for example, the Egyptian pyramids. You probably imagine grand architects and skilled stonecutters working under the blazing desert sun. But what about the countless labourers hauling stone, the workers who prepared meals for these men, or those who built the scaffolding and infrastructure around the site? Without them, the pyramids wouldn't have been possible. Yet we rarely hear about these individuals in history lessons. It's not just the builders we should remember, it's everyone involved in bringing these immense projects to life. We often think of scribes as those who simply wrote things down, but they were so much more than that. Scribes were the glue that held ancient societies together. They were the ones recording everything, from royal decrees to tax data, from literature to astronomy, and making sure it was preserved for future generations. Imagine being a scribe in ancient Egypt, tasked with writing the history of the pharaohs or copying sacred texts for temples. Their work was meticulous, requiring skill and patience that many modern people would struggle to comprehend. Historians still argue whether scribes were simply recorders of history or whether they had a role in shaping it. Were they just documenting the events that happened, or were they subtly influencing the way history was written? You see, in a world without print media, scribes had an incredible amount of power. They could frame stories, present kings in a favourable light, or even make small changes that could alter the course of history. The written word was everything in the ancient world, and scribes were the ones who controlled it. But it wasn't just about writing. The art of the scribe was sacred. In many civilizations, the ability to write was considered a divine gift. In Egypt, scribes were often seen as intermediaries between the gods and humans, using their skills to transcribe divine messages. Some scribes even worked in temples, copying religious texts, recording rituals, and keeping the sacred knowledge of the gods alive. They played a role in preserving the spiritual and cultural identity of their societies, which is why we know so much about ancient civilizations today. Without the efforts of these quiet workers, much of ancient history would have been lost to time. Let's zoom out for a moment and look at the broader impact of these invisible workers. It wasn't just the scribes who were essential to the success of ancient civilizations. It was also the labourers who built the structures we still marvel at today. When you think of the pyramids, the Colosseum, or the Great Wall of China, you probably picture these grand structures rising majestically into the sky. But for every block of stone, every piece of marble, there was a worker doing the dirty, often dangerous job of construction. In ancient Egypt, for example, there were thousands of workers involved in pyramid construction. These workers didn't just lay bricks. They had to carve and shape the stones, transport them across the desert, and carefully fit them together. And that was just one aspect of the construction process. There were also the workers who built the roads leading to the pyramid sites, the engineers who designed the scaffolding, and the labourers who worked to provide food and water for the entire operation. Without all these invisible workers, there would be no pyramids, just a dusty desert. And the same was true for other great civilizations. In ancient Rome, the construction of roads, aqueducts, and public buildings was essential to the empire's success. But the workers who built these structures, the stonecutters, masons, labourers, are largely forgotten. Instead, we remember the emperors who commissioned these projects, the generals who fought for Roman dominance, and the poets who chronicled the empire's history. But without those everyday workers who built Rome from the ground up, none of it would have been possible. Now let's return to the scribes for a moment. There's an interesting debate among historians about the role of scribes in preserving knowledge. While we often associate scribes with the written word, they were also responsible for ensuring the survival of knowledge in other forms. In ancient Greece, for example, scribes worked to preserve the writings of philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. Without their efforts, these texts might have been lost to time. The same goes for the ancient Romans, who relied on scribes to transcribe important legal documents, treaties, and historical records. But here's where the debate comes in. Some historians argue that scribes didn't just preserve knowledge, they actively shaped it. They may have added their own interpretations, altered facts, or even invented stories to suit the needs of the ruling class. After all, they were often working for kings, emperors, and religious leaders, so their writings had to align with the interests of these powerful figures. But was this manipulation? Or were scribes simply doing their jobs, following the instructions they were given? It's a topic that still sparks debate among scholars, and it's a reminder of just how much power the written word held in the ancient world. This is just the beginning of our journey into the hidden world of ancient workers. We'll explore many more of these invisible roles as we move through the history of empires, those who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make these civilizations thrive. And as we go along, you'll realize just how essential these workers were to the rise and fall of empires. It wasn't just the kings and generals who made history. It was the everyday people, those who worked quietly in the background, ensuring the survival and success of the civilizations we still study today. Remember when we talked about those unsung heroes, scribes and workers, who kept the gears of ancient societies turning? Well, let's go deeper into one of the quietest, yet most powerful roles of all, the scribes. They weren't just people scribbling away on papyrus or clay tablets. They were the lifeblood of ancient knowledge and administration. If you were to step into the shoes of a scribe in ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, you'd be part of an exclusive group that could read, write, and, let's be honest, control the flow of information. Imagine waking up before dawn, the warm golden glow of the desert sun just starting to rise. You sit down with your ink pot and papyrus scroll, ready to transcribe the latest royal decree. It's not just a job, it's a sacred duty. As you carefully dip your reed pen into the ink, you're acutely aware that what you write could affect the fate of a kingdom. You don't just copy what you're given, you interpret, you communicate, you shape the narrative. Historians still debate whether scribes were just passive record keepers, or whether they had a hand in steering history in the direction they saw fit. Some scholars argue that scribes were essentially the ghostwriters of ancient times, shaping royal propaganda or religious texts to suit the needs of the ruling class. Scribes didn't just preserve records for posterity. They crafted them in such a way that future generations could glimpse the civilization's essence, its ideals, its values. If you were a scribe in ancient Egypt, you might have worked on the texts found in the tombs of pharaohs, ensuring that the ruler's achievements were immortalized in the afterlife. But not all scribes worked for the pharaohs. Some were employed by merchants, helping with trade records, tax calculations, and other essential administrative tasks. In fact, many of the world's oldest surviving documents are the work of these humble scribes, ranging from legal contracts to love poems and stories. But this wasn't a job for just anyone. To become a scribe was an honor, requiring years of training. The young scribes-to-be started their education in scribal schools, where they learned not only the art of writing, but also the history and religion of their people. Imagine being a young student in a classroom filled with the scent of ink and the soft rustle of papyrus. Your teacher, probably a stern, middle-aged man with a long beard, would teach you the sacred scripts, the art of writing in cuneiform or hieroglyphs. The level of skill required was staggering. These scribes weren't just churning out documents, they were artists, perfecting each stroke of the pen. And just like artists, scribes sometimes enjoyed a certain level of prestige. In ancient Egypt, for example, the job came with a good deal of respect. They were often among the most educated people in society, with access to the elite and, at times, the royal court itself. In Mesopotamia, the scribes were so revered that they sometimes held high positions in the bureaucracy. Yet despite their power and influence, they were often overlooked in historical accounts. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries, when archaeologists began unearthing ancient tablets, that we started to truly appreciate just how vital these scribes were in shaping the ancient world. Of course, not all scribes had it easy. Many worked long hours in dimly lit rooms, their eyes straining as they meticulously copied texts by hand. The role was often solitary and repetitive, but the importance of the work couldn't be overstated. Without scribes, we wouldn't have a written record of the past. We wouldn't know the names of pharaohs like Ramses or Cleopatra, or the triumphs and failures of ancient empires. We wouldn't have the great works of literature that survive from Mesopotamia, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, a tale that still resonates with us today. But despite the vital role they played, scribes weren't always in the limelight. In many societies, they were considered part of the lower nobility or the middle class. They weren't warriors or kings, but they wielded a different kind of power, the power of knowledge. The ancient world was built on information, and scribes were the ones who organised, preserved, and transmitted that information. They were the ones who ensured that knowledge wasn't lost to the ages. But let's not romanticise the life of a scribe too much. It was a demanding job, often with little to no reward beyond the satisfaction of completing a difficult task. Many scribes worked in silence, with no recognition or glory. They didn't get to enjoy the pomp and circumstance of the ruling elite. They were the background players, the quiet workers who made sure the show went on. And yet, they were indispensable. Historians argue about the influence of scribes on the shaping of ancient societies, but there's no doubt that they were key to the transmission of knowledge, the maintenance of order, and the very foundation of empire. Without scribes, the written word would not have spread as far and wide as it did. Without scribes, the mighty empires of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and beyond would not have left a trace. Let's also take a moment to consider a quirky tidbit about scribes. It's said that ancient Egyptian scribes had a peculiar superstition. They believed that the god Thoth, the god of writing and knowledge, would bless them with divine power if they were particularly skilled in their craft. Some scribes even wore special amulets to ensure that Thoth's favour was upon them. In a way, they were like the rock stars of the ancient world, except instead of guitars, they wielded reed pens. Historians still argue whether scribes were merely executing their work, or whether they played a more active role in shaping history. Some believe they were simply servants of the ruling class, while others contend that scribes were capable of influencing the future through the stories they wrote. Were they simply recording history as it happened, or were they actively shaping it? It's a debate that's still ongoing, but one thing is certain. Without scribes, we would know far less about the ancient world. Now that you've got a glimpse into the fascinating world of scribes, let's zoom out a bit and shift our focus to another essential, though largely forgotten group of workers, the builders of the grand structures that define ancient civilizations. You've probably seen the pictures. Massive pyramids rising from the desert, towering temples with columns that seem to touch the sky, and the awe-inspiring amphitheatres of Rome. But what you don't often see are the labourers who made these structures possible. They didn't command the spotlight or bask in glory, but without them, there would be no monuments, no history. Picture it. The sun is scorching, the air is thick with dust, and the rhythmic sound of hammering and chiselling echoes in the distance. You're one of the workers, tasked with hauling heavy stones to build the Great Pyramid of Giza. It's a back-breaking, gruelling job, but it's one that has to be done. The pyramids weren't just architectural marvels, they were the tombs of pharaohs, meant to ensure their safe passage to the afterlife. And while the pharaohs may have been immortalised in stone, it was the thousands of labourers who made it possible. Historians still argue whether these workers were slaves or voluntary labourers, though recent evidence suggests that many of them were skilled labourers who worked in exchange for food, shelter, and a steady income. You might think of the Egyptian pyramid builders as slaves, but that's a misconception. In fact, archaeologists have discovered workers' villages near the pyramids, complete with bakeries and cemeteries, suggesting that these labourers had a sense of community and were far from the chattel slavery that's often associated with ancient Egypt. The work itself was astonishing. Each block of the pyramid weighed several tons, and there were millions of them. How did they move these massive stones? While the exact methods are still debated, it's believed that the workers used a combination of ramps, levers, and sheer manpower to move and position the blocks. Imagine standing at the base of a massive pyramid, watching as workers carefully hoist a huge stone into place, their muscles straining under the weight. Every step in the construction process was meticulously planned, and the workers, many of whom were experts in their craft, played a vital role in turning the vision of the pharaohs into reality. But the pyramid builders weren't alone in their efforts. In ancient Rome, there was another set of workers responsible for shaping the empire's infrastructure: the road builders. Roman roads were legendary for their durability and efficiency, and without them, the Roman Empire wouldn't have been able to expand as far as it did. The work was dangerous and often deadly, with workers laying down miles of road through challenging terrain, from the rugged hills of northern Italy to the arid deserts of North Africa. Yet, the builders of these roads, just like those who worked on the pyramids, received little recognition. Their names were lost to history, their contributions overlooked, despite the fact that without them, the empire could not have functioned. The Roman roads were a feat of engineering designed to last for centuries. They were constructed with multiple layers, starting with a foundation of crushed stone, followed by a layer of gravel, and then topped with large paving stones. The result was a smooth, durable road surface that could withstand the elements and the constant traffic of Roman legions, merchants, and civilians. But the construction of these roads required an enormous amount of labour that came from those who were tasked with digging trenches, moving materials, and laying the foundation. And then there were the aqueducts, the engineering marvels that brought fresh water to cities across the Roman Empire. These structures were essential for the empire's growth, providing water for everything from drinking to bathing, and even for powering the mills that produced goods for trade. But who built the aqueducts? Who designed and constructed the vast network of channels that transported water from distant sources to the heart of the empire? Once again, it was the labourers who worked in the background, often in difficult and dangerous conditions, who made these incredible feats of engineering possible. Of course, the builders of ancient empires didn't always work in isolation. In ancient Mesopotamia, for example, the construction of the ziggurats, the massive stepped pyramids dedicated to the gods, required not just workers, but skilled artisans, architects, and engineers. The ziggurats were not just religious structures, they were symbols of the king's power and the gods' favour. The workers who built them, however, were far from the royal elite. They were the labourers, the artisans, the craftsmen who brought these massive structures to life, using simple tools and techniques that required incredible precision. And what about the workers who created the iconic statues and reliefs that adorned the temples and palaces of ancient civilizations? Think of the famous sculptures of ancient Greece and Rome, statues of gods, emperors, and warriors frozen in time. These sculptures didn't just materialize out of thin air. They were the result of countless hours of labor, spent chipping away at blocks of marble or casting figures in bronze. The artisans who created these masterpieces were not only skilled sculptors, but also painters, decorators, and engineers. Their work brought life to the stone and metal, creating a lasting legacy of the ancient world. But here's the catch. Much of the labour behind these great structures was invisible. The workers who built the pyramids, the roads, and the aqueducts were often anonymous, their contributions overshadowed by the glory of the emperors, kings, and gods they served. Historians still argue about the specifics of how these projects were carried out, but one thing is certain. Without the invisible labourers, the empires we study today would not have existed. Historians still debate whether these workers were truly free, or whether they were coerced into labour for the benefit of the ruling class. Some argue that many of them were prisoners of war or slaves, while others contend that they were simply part of the workforce needed to maintain the infrastructure of an empire. Regardless of their status, however, one thing is clear. Without these workers, the ancient world as we know it would not have been possible. These workers didn't just build physical structures, they helped shape the very fabric of ancient society. They were the ones who made the grand visions of emperors and kings a reality, who transformed the ideas of architects and engineers into tangible, lasting monuments. And yet, like the scribes, they remain largely invisible in the grand narrative of history. As we continue our journey through the unseen workers who powered ancient civilizations, let's shift focus to another fascinating group, the perfume makers. Now, you might be thinking, perfume, how does that fit into the ancient world? Well, it turns out that perfume and fragrance weren't just luxury items or afterthoughts. They were deeply woven into the fabric of ancient societies, from Egypt to Rome, and they played a significant role in both the everyday lives of people and in the religious and political rituals that defined those societies. Imagine yourself walking through the bustling streets of an ancient city like Babylon or Alexandria. The air is thick with the aroma of spices, incense, and exotic oils. people rubbed fragrant oils on their skin, light incense in temples, and wear perfume not just to smell pleasant, but to symbolize status, wealth, and even divine favor. The perfume makers, often invisible in the background, were the unsung heroes who created the concoctions that defined the smells of the ancient world. Historians often debate the origins of perfume, but there's no question that it was a booming industry in the ancient world. The Egyptians were pioneers in the art of perfume making. They understood the power of scent, how it could be used to enhance beauty, communicate status, and even create an atmosphere of holiness. The pharaohs didn't just bathe in lavish oils. They wore perfumes during religious ceremonies, offering the gods sweet-smelling incense and oils as a sign of devotion. It wasn't just about personal hygiene or luxury. Fragrance had a spiritual purpose too. Ancient perfume makers used a variety of ingredients to create their products. The base of most perfumes was oil, often olive oil or sesame oil, which acted as a carrier for the aromatic substances. But the real magic happened with the ingredients. Flowers, resins, spices, and even crushed gemstones. Some perfumes were made from rare and expensive materials, like frankincense, myrrh, and cinnamon, while others were made from more common flowers like jasmine and rose. The blending of these ingredients required immense skill, as each scent had to be balanced perfectly to create a pleasing fragrance. It wasn't just about mixing oils, it was about capturing the essence of nature itself. Perfume was not just for the elite. While it's true that the wealthiest individuals and royal families were the primary consumers of luxury perfumes, the art of fragrance making was widespread. In fact, evidence suggests that even the working classes in ancient Egypt used simple perfumes, such as flower-scented oils, as part of their daily routines. Imagine a simple farmer in ancient Egypt, after a long day in the fields, taking a moment to rub fragrant oil on their skin before going to bed. It wasn't just for vanity. It was part of a broader cultural tradition that tied fragrance to the rhythms of daily life. But the role of perfume makers wasn't just confined to beauty and hygiene. They were also essential in religious rituals. In temples across the ancient world, incense and oils were burned in the worship of gods. Priests and priestesses would anoint idols with sacred oils, and incense would rise up in clouds as an offering to the deities. This wasn't just about creating a pleasant smell. It was about creating an atmosphere of reverence and sanctity. The act of perfuming wasn't just a physical one, it was a spiritual offering. And behind the scenes, the perfume makers were the ones creating the oils and incense that were burned in these sacred ceremonies. The role of perfume makers in religious and political life is often overlooked, but it's important to understand that their work played a critical part in shaping the culture of ancient societies. They helped define what beauty and holiness looked like, and their work was deeply tied to the power structures that governed these civilizations. In Rome, for example, perfume was an important symbol of wealth and status. The elite class would often wear heavily scented oils and perfumes, signalling their wealth and sophistication. But perfume was also used as a tool of diplomacy. When a foreign dignitary visited Rome, they were often presented with luxurious perfumes as gifts, a sign of respect and goodwill. Historians still argue whether the perfume industry was as vast and influential as we think. Some scholars suggest that the importance of perfume might have been overstated, arguing that while it was significant, it wasn't as central to society as other industries, like agriculture or trade. Others contend that the cultural significance of perfume cannot be understated, as it was deeply intertwined with social status, religious rituals, and even politics. Were the perfume makers simply creating luxury goods for the elite, or did they play a more central role in the daily functioning of society? This is a question that still sparks debate. Let's pause for a quirky tidbit about ancient perfume making. In ancient Egypt, perfume was so valued that it was sometimes used as a form of currency. Wealthy individuals would gift elaborate perfumes as a way to show favour, and some ancient records even suggest that perfume was used as part of marriage dowries. Imagine that. Perfume as an economic tool, trading hands in much the same way that gold or land would. It's a far cry from today's perfume bottles, which are often viewed as little more than luxury items. Now consider this. The art of perfume making wasn't just restricted to the ancient world. The fragrance industry has a long history, stretching all the way from the ancient Egyptians to today's modern perfumeries. While the materials have evolved and the methods have advanced, the essence of perfume making, the blending of nature's scents into something both personal and sacred, has remained remarkably consistent. The ancient perfume makers were ahead of their time in more ways than one, and they left behind a legacy that continues to influence the world of fragrance to this day. Perfume making may seem like a delicate, glamorous art, but when you think about it, it's rooted in practicality. These workers didn't just create pleasant smells, they were crafting something that was intertwined with life itself: beauty, religion, and status. Without them, the ancient world wouldn't have had the same allure, and many of the rituals that defined ancient societies would have felt incomplete. Historians still argue whether perfume was truly as essential as it was perceived. Some believe it was nothing more than a luxury for the elite, while others suggest it was a critical part of religious and social life. Were perfume makers simply catering to the desires of the wealthy, or were they essential to the cultural fabric of ancient societies? Like many aspects of ancient life, the true answer may never be fully known. Now that we've explored the fragrant world of ancient perfume makers, let's turn our attention to a truly vital, yet often overlooked group: the farmers who sustained the empires. Without their tireless labour in the fields, there would have been no food for the citizens, no grain to feed the soldiers, and no harvest to offer the gods. Farmers in ancient civilizations were not simply working the land. They were the backbone of society, feeding entire cities and ensuring that the empire had enough resources to thrive. Imagine yourself as a farmer in ancient Rome or Egypt, standing in the early morning light as the fields stretch out before you. The air is fresh, and the dew is still clinging to the blades of wheat. You've got a long day ahead of you, but this work is essential. Without the grains you harvest, there would be no bread for the citizens of Rome, no sustenance for the army that defends the empire, and no offerings for the gods who are believed to control the harvest. You're part of a larger system, a system that relies on the delicate balance of nature, human labour, and divine favour. The role of farmers in ancient societies was critical, and yet they often went unrecognised. In ancient Egypt, for example, the Nile River flooded each year, depositing nutrient-rich silt on the land. This made the soil ideal for growing crops like wheat, barley, and flax. The agricultural cycle was deeply tied to the rhythm of the river, and the success of the harvest depended on the careful management of this natural resource. Farmers in Egypt were tasked with planting, tending, and harvesting the crops that sustained the empire. They didn't just grow food, they grew the foundation of Egypt's power. But being a farmer in ancient Egypt wasn't just about cultivating crops. It was also about understanding the complex relationship between the land, the river, and the gods. The annual flooding of the Nile was seen as a divine blessing, and the success of the harvest was believed to be tied to the favour of the gods. Farmers didn't simply plant their crops and wait for them to grow. They participated in religious rituals, offering prayers and sacrifices to ensure that the gods would bless the land with a good harvest. The work of farming was deeply intertwined with the spiritual life of the community. Similarly, in ancient Mesopotamia, farming was a fundamental part of society. The fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers supported the growth of crops like barley, wheat, and dates, which were essential for both food and trade. But farming in Mesopotamia came with its own set of challenges. Unlike the Egyptians, who had the predictable flooding of the Nile, farmers in Mesopotamia had to rely on irrigation systems to water their crops. This meant building and maintaining canals, dikes, and reservoirs to ensure that the fields were adequately irrigated. The work was hard and often dangerous, but it was essential to the survival of the civilization. Historians still debate how much recognition ancient farmers received for their work. Some argue that they were seen as vital contributors to society, while others suggest that they were often relegated to the lower echelons of social hierarchies. Despite their importance, many farmers were treated as little more than workers who toiled in the fields without much social status or reward. In ancient Rome, for instance, the upper classes often looked down on farming as a laborious, unglamorous task, preferring instead to focus on military or political pursuits. Yet, without the food grown by these farmers, Rome would have been unable to sustain its vast population. The ancient farmer's role was also crucial in the context of warfare. Armies require a vast amount of food to maintain their strength, and without farmers, there would have been no provisions for the soldiers who fought to expand and protect the empire. In ancient Rome, soldiers were often required to help with the harvest during times of war. This collaboration between farmers and soldiers ensured that the empire's military campaigns could continue uninterrupted. The farmers didn't just supply food for their own families, they supplied the very sustenance needed to fuel the empire's conquests. And let's not forget about the agricultural innovations that came from these hardworking individuals. While ancient farming might seem rudimentary by today's standards, many of the techniques developed by farmers in ancient civilizations laid the foundation for modern agriculture. In Egypt, for example, the development of irrigation systems allowed farmers to control the flow of water, ensuring that crops would grow even during dry spells. In Mesopotamia, the plough was invented, revolutionizing the way crops were harvested and enabling farmers to work the land more efficiently. These innovations were passed down through the generations, contributing to the growth of civilizations and the development of agriculture as we know it today. There's also an interesting debate among historians about the role of women in ancient farming communities. While farming was often seen as a male-dominated occupation, evidence suggests that women played a significant role in agricultural work. In many ancient cultures, women were responsible for tasks like planting, harvesting, and processing crops. They also helped with the management of food stores and the preparation of meals. Some scholars argue that women's contributions to agriculture were undervalued, while others suggest that their role in farming was more equal to men's than we often think. Regardless of gender, the contributions of farmers, both male and female, were essential to the survival of ancient civilizations. One quirky tidbit about ancient farming that's worth noting is the practice of crop rotation. In ancient Greece and Rome, farmers would rotate the crops they planted in order to preserve the soil's fertility. This practice wasn't just a pragmatic solution, it was a reflection of the deep understanding farmers had of the natural world. They knew that planting the same crops year after year could deplete the soil, and they took steps to prevent this. Crop rotation allowed them to grow a diverse range of crops while keeping the soil healthy and productive. This knowledge passed down through generations and eventually led to the agricultural techniques we use today. Historians still argue whether farmers in ancient civilizations received the recognition they deserved. Were they seen as essential to society, or were they dismissed as low-status labourers? Some scholars contend that farmers were the true heroes of ancient societies, sustaining the populations that built the great cities and empires. Others believe that their contributions were overshadowed by the more glamorous aspects of ancient life, like warfare, politics, and religion. Regardless of their status, the farmers of ancient civilizations played an irreplaceable role in the success of these societies, and without them, the empires we study today would have crumbled away. Let's continue our journey by exploring another invisible group of workers, the silent shippers who kept the flow of goods, ideas, and resources moving across vast distances. In ancient empires, whether it was Egypt, Rome, or China, maritime trade was vital for sustaining these civilizations. Goods such as grain, luxury items, spices, and even soldiers were moved across seas and rivers by a fleet of largely invisible sailors, shipbuilders, and merchants. Without them, the empires would have been confined to their borders, unable to reach the global scale of power they achieved. Imagine the bustling docks of Alexandria, a hub of commerce in the ancient Mediterranean. The air smells of salt water, and the rhythmic sound of waves crashing against the stone piers fills the air. Sailors unload massive cargo ships, ships laden with goods from as far away as India, Africa, and the Far East. You stand at the dock watching as the labourers work tirelessly to unload and distribute the goods. Grain from Egypt, silk from China, spices from India, and wine from Greece. These materials are the lifeblood of the empire, and the people behind the scenes, loading and unloading the ships, are the ones who make it all happen. Without their work, trade wouldn't exist, and empires like Rome would never have been able to grow into the global powerhouses they were. Maritime trade in ancient Rome was particularly crucial. The empire's vast territory stretched across 3 continents, and much of its economic and military strength came from its ability to transport goods and soldiers quickly and efficiently. The Roman navy played a significant role in protecting trade routes, while merchant ships carried goods from one province to another and from across the seas. The shipping industry wasn't just about moving material, it was about ensuring the empire's stability. A lack of ships or protection could bring entire provinces to a standstill, affecting everything from food supplies to military equipment. But behind every successful merchant ship, there was a team of workers who made it all possible. First, there were the shipbuilders, who crafted the vessels that would carry goods across vast distances. The Roman navy, for instance, had specialized shipbuilders who designed and constructed warships capable of carrying large amounts of cargo while also withstanding the rigors of battle. The art of shipbuilding was a delicate craft, requiring immense knowledge of the sea, the materials used, and the construction techniques that could withstand the constant pounding of the ocean waves. Shipbuilders also had to be familiar with the technology of their time. Roman ships, for example, were equipped with a variety of features designed to maximize their efficiency. They used a type of anchor known as the stock anchor, which helped secure the ships to the shore while loading or unloading goods. And then there were the sails. Roman ships were often equipped with multiple masts and sails to catch the wind from different directions, allowing them to sail more efficiently across the Mediterranean. This kind of shipbuilding expertise was passed down from generation to generation, shaping the very nature of ancient maritime trade. But even once the ships were built, the work didn't stop. Loading and unloading the ships was a massive undertaking. Workers would use cranes, pulleys, and sheer manpower to move cargo from the ships to the docks, and vice versa. The ships that sailed the Mediterranean were often packed to the brim with goods, and unloading them required precision and coordination. Merchants would need to arrange for the transport of goods from the dock to markets and storage areas, and once the ships were unloaded, the process started all over again, with more goods being packed onto the vessels to continue the journey. Sailing itself wasn't without its challenges. The sea was unpredictable, and even the best-laid plans could be disrupted by storms, pirate attacks, or faulty navigation. A single miscalculation could mean disaster for a ship and its cargo, with entire shipments of grain or luxury items lost to the depths. Sailors had to be skilled navigators, knowing the tides, currents, and stars to chart their course. They had to know when to leave port and when to return, and they had to be ready to face the dangers of the open sea. While much of the focus in ancient maritime history tends to be on the great seafaring expeditions of the time, it's important to remember that those quiet, everyday sailors played a crucial role in keeping the empire supplied with the goods it needed to survive. One fascinating aspect of ancient shipping is the role of naval warfare in protecting these trade routes. The Roman Empire, for example, depended heavily on its navy to secure the Mediterranean and protect merchant ships from pirates. While the navy's primary job was military, it also played a critical role in safeguarding the flow of goods between provinces. Pirate attacks were a constant threat, especially in the waters surrounding the Aegean Sea, where the rugged terrain provided perfect hiding spots for pirates. The Romans, however, had a sophisticated system in place to combat piracy, relying on a combination of naval patrols and military outposts along the coast. The navy was the empire's first line of defence, ensuring that the lifeblood of the economy, maritime trade, continued unhindered. Historians still debate the exact scale of the ancient shipping industry. Some scholars argue that maritime trade in the ancient world was smaller and more localized than we think, while others contend that it was an incredibly complex system, capable of supporting entire empires. While we'll likely never know the true extent of the industry, it's clear that shipping was essential to the success of ancient civilizations. Without the work of the shipbuilders, sailors, and dock workers who managed the flow of goods across seas, empires like Rome would not have been able to flourish. The vastness of these ancient trade networks remains one of the most impressive achievements in history, and yet the workers who made it all possible are often relegated to the margins. But here's a quirky tidbit for you. Did you know that ancient Romans sometimes used special shipping insurance to protect against the loss of goods during transport? Merchants could buy a form of insurance to ensure that they'd be compensated in case their goods were lost at sea. Of course, the idea of insurance in the modern sense didn't exist back then, but the concept of safeguarding shipments was alive and well. Historians still argue whether the maritime trade system in ancient times was as sophisticated as some of the more modern trade networks we have today. Were these early merchants, sailors, and shipbuilders as innovative as we think? Or were they simply relying on traditional techniques that had been passed down for generations? Some believe that the ancient world's shipping networks were more rudimentary than we often give them credit for, while others claim that they were just as advanced in their own way. Whatever the case may be, it's clear that without the quiet shippers, the ones who built the ships, sailed the seas, and made sure goods kept moving, ancient empires would have struggled to survive. Now that we've seen how crucial the shippers were in the ancient world, let's move on to another fascinating yet often overlooked group of workers, the miners. When we think of ancient wealth, we often picture glittering treasures, majestic palaces, and fine jewellery. But these luxuries didn't come from nowhere. The precious metals and stones that adorned crowns, filled temples, and powered economies were extracted from the earth by a dedicated workforce of miners. These men and women risked their lives, often working in perilous conditions, to unearth the raw materials that fueled the empire's greatest achievements. Imagine standing at the mouth of a mine in ancient Egypt or Rome, a lantern in hand as you descend deep into the earth. The air is thick, and the walls are damp with moisture. You're surrounded by the faint clinking of pickaxes and the low murmur of your fellow miners as they dig for precious metals like gold, silver, or copper. The work is grueling and dangerous, but without the materials you're extracting, the empire would have nothing to power its currency, its armies, or its art. You might not realize it, but your work is supporting the very foundation of the empire's wealth and influence. Mining in ancient civilizations was not just about extracting resources. It was also about the complex systems of organization and labor that made it possible. The mines were often staffed with large crews of workers, many of whom were slaves or prisoners of war. These workers toiled in conditions that were both physically demanding and perilous. The mining sites were usually located far from cities, in desolate, hard-to-reach areas. In ancient Egypt, for example, gold mines were often found in the eastern desert, a harsh and unforgiving environment. Similarly, in Rome, the silver mines of Spain were vital to the empire's currency system, but they were also incredibly dangerous, with workers spending long hours underground, extracting ore with rudimentary tools. One of the most notable aspects of ancient mining was the reliance on slave labour. In the Roman Empire especially, slaves made up a large percentage of the mining workforce. These individuals were often captured during military conquests or bought and sold in markets, and their labour was exploited to meet the empire's insatiable demand for precious metals and stones. While some scholars argue that free workers were also employed in mining, there's no question that slavery played a central role in this industry. The mines were grueling places to work, and it's likely that many miners never saw the light of day again after entering the mines. But it wasn't just about labour. Mining also required a sophisticated understanding of technology and engineering. Ancient miners had to devise ways to extract metals efficiently and safely, and this often meant developing complex systems of ventilation, drainage, and transportation. In ancient Rome, for example, mining operations often involved the use of water wheels and pumps to remove water from deep mine shafts. The Romans were also known for using fire-setting techniques, where the heat from a fire would crack rocks, making it easier to extract valuable metals. The ingenuity of these ancient miners laid the groundwork for modern mining techniques. Gold, in particular, played a pivotal role in the ancient world. It wasn't just a symbol of wealth, it was also used as currency in religious rituals and as a form of tribute. The famous gold mines of ancient Egypt, for example, were a major source of the pharaoh's wealth. The gold mined in these operations was often used to craft elaborate jewellery, statues and offerings for the gods. In fact, much of the art and architecture we associate with ancient Egypt, such as the burial masks of pharaohs, was made from gold extracted by miners. Gold wasn't just precious, it was sacred. It was believed to be the flesh of the gods, and it was used to honour them. Similarly, silver mining was a key aspect of the Roman economy. Silver was used to mint coins, which in turn were used to pay soldiers, build infrastructure, and fund military campaigns. The mines of Spain were some of the most productive in the Roman Empire, and the silver extracted from them was vital to maintaining Rome's military power and expanding its borders. However, the mining process itself was brutal. In addition to the physical toll on the workers, the conditions in the mines were often unsafe, and many miners suffered from diseases caused by poor ventilation and the inhalation of dust and fumes. In addition to precious metals, ancient miners also extracted stones like marble and granite, which were used to build the great structures that defined these civilizations. The famous white marble of the Parthenon in Athens, for example, came from quarries on Mount Pentelicus, while the marble used in Roman architecture was often sourced from Carrara in Italy. These materials were integral to the construction of temples, public buildings, and monuments. But just like the metal miners, the stone workers faced long hours, dangerous conditions, and back-breaking labour. One interesting tidbit about ancient mining that you might not know is the use of early mining engineers. These individuals were highly skilled workers who were responsible for overseeing mining operations and ensuring that the mining process was as efficient and safe as possible. In ancient Rome, the mining engineer was known as the metallurgus, and they were tasked with managing the labour force, designing the mining structures, and ensuring that the materials were extracted in the most effective way. The metallurgist was a vital role, but like most of the workers, they often went unrecognised in historical records. Historians still debate how much of ancient mining was done by slaves versus free workers. Some believe that slaves made up the majority of the workforce, while others argue that free men worked alongside slaves, especially in regions where mining required specialised skills. Regardless of the workforce composition, one thing is certain. Mining played a central role in the prosperity of ancient civilizations. The wealth of Egypt, Rome, and other empires was built on the raw materials that came from the earth, and it was the miners, silent and unseen, who made it all possible. Mining was not just a dangerous and grueling job, it was a vital part of sustaining the empire. Without the resources extracted from the earth, there would have been no wealth, no infrastructure, and no military power to protect the empire. The ancient miners, like so many other invisible workers, are often forgotten in the grand narrative of history. Yet, without their efforts, the great empires of antiquity would have been nothing more than distant dreams. After exploring the miners who dug deep into the earth for precious metals, let's now turn our attention to another crucial but often overlooked group, the artisans. These individuals were the unsung heroes who crafted the luxury goods, weapons, and intricate items that adorned the courts of kings and queens, filled the temples of gods, and powered the economies of ancient civilizations. Their hands shaped the very objects that became symbols of wealth, power, and artistry. From pottery to jewellery to intricate sculptures, the work of ancient artisans laid the foundation for much of what we now consider art. Imagine stepping into a workshop in ancient Athens or Rome. The air is thick with the smell of burning wood, metal, and clay. The sound of hammers ringing against anvils, the rhythmic turning of a potter's wheel, and the soft scraping of tools against stone fill the room. You watch in awe as the artisan before you delicately chisels a statue of a god, or carves a piece of ivory into a beautiful, intricate design. The artisan's hands are steady, their mind focused on the work at hand. This is not just a craft. It's a skill passed down through generations, honed to perfection over the years. These artisans don't just create objects, they shape the identity of the civilization itself. In ancient Greece, for example, the pottery was not just functional, it was a form of art. The famed black figure and red figure pottery, which depicts everything from daily life to mythological stories, is one of the most important contributions of ancient Greece to the world. These pieces were often crafted by anonymous artisans who worked tirelessly to create intricate designs that would not only serve everyday purposes, but also honour the gods and document the history of the times. The skill and artistry involved in these pots were highly respected in their own right, though the potters themselves often received little recognition for their work. In Rome, artisans created not only beautiful objects, but also the tools and weapons that helped maintain the empire's dominance. Roman weapons, particularly the famous Roman gladius sword, were crafted with great care by blacksmiths who used techniques passed down through generations. These weapons weren't just tools of war, they were symbols of Roman power and military might. The artisans who crafted them weren't soldiers or generals, they were the quiet workers behind the scenes, making sure the army was equipped and ready to defend the empire. Similarly, in ancient Egypt, artisans were responsible for creating some of the most iconic pieces of art in history. The tombs of pharaohs are filled with beautifully crafted jewellery, statues and reliefs, each piece meticulously created by artisans who were masters of their craft. These artisans weren't just working for the pharaohs, they were working to ensure that the pharaoh's legacy would endure for eternity. The jewellery made for the pharaohs, such as the famous burial mask of King Tutankhamun, is still celebrated today for its beauty and craftsmanship. Historians still debate the social status of artisans in ancient societies. While it's clear that they played a crucial role in the economy and cultural development of these civilizations, their place in society was often ambiguous. In many cases, artisans were considered to be part of the lower classes, working for wages that were often meagre. However, some artisans, especially those who worked for the royal courts or the temples, could attain a degree of prestige and recognition. In ancient Egypt, for instance, some artisans who worked on royal tombs were highly respected, and could even enjoy special privileges. Still, most artisans lived humbly, their work largely going unnoticed by history. One fascinating aspect of ancient craftsmanship was the degree to which artisans were able to innovate and experiment. Take, for example, the ancient Roman glassmakers, who were responsible for creating the first blown glass. This revolutionary technique allowed them to create glassware and decorative objects that were both beautiful and practical. The Roman glassblowers, working in workshops, developed intricate patterns and designs that were sold across the empire. Their work had a lasting impact on the glassmaking industry, and the legacy of Roman glass art can still be seen today in modern glassware and artistic creations. Another interesting tidbit about ancient artisans is the use of workshops as both places of production and learning. These workshops were often family-run businesses, with skills being passed down from one generation to the next. It wasn't just about making products, it was about teaching the craft. Apprentices would begin their training at a young age, learning the techniques and secrets of the trade from their elders. These workshops were often bustling with activity, with artisans working side by side to create the goods that would be sold in markets or presented to the elites. The work was steady and often repetitive, but it was also a vital part of the economy. Historians still debate the role of artisans in shaping ancient society. Some argue that their work was purely functional, created for the wealthy and powerful to enjoy. Others suggest that artisans played a more central role in shaping the culture and identity of these civilizations. For example, the art and architecture of ancient Greece and Rome were essential to the way these cultures saw themselves. The pottery, sculptures, and buildings created by artisans were not just objects. They were expressions of cultural values and ideals. These works captured the essence of what it meant to be Greek or Roman and served as lasting symbols of these civilizations. But let's not romanticize the life of an artisan too much. The work was often tedious and physically demanding. In ancient Egypt, for example, the creation of statues and reliefs could take months, even years. The artisans had to work with primitive tools, and mistakes could mean starting over from scratch. The conditions in the workshops were often cramped and uncomfortable, and the long hours could take a toll on the artisan's health. The fact that these workers created some of the most beautiful art in history despite these challenges speaks to their skill, perseverance, and passion for their craft. Historians still debate whether artisans were truly appreciated for their work during their lifetimes. Were they seen as important contributors to society, or were they just viewed as labourers creating goods for the rich and powerful? Some believe that artisans were not given the credit they deserved for their contributions to culture and society, while others argue that their work was highly valued and respected in ancient times. Regardless of how they were perceived, the legacy of these artisans lives on today. The art, jewellery, pottery, and sculptures they created continue to inspire awe and admiration, serving as a reminder of the incredible skill and creativity of the ancient world. Let's now turn to a group of workers who, while not often at the centre of ancient civilization narratives, played an absolutely essential role in daily life: the water carriers. These seemingly humble individuals were tasked with the vital job of bringing fresh water into cities, temples, and households. Without them, the ancient world would have struggled to function. Water was the lifeblood of every civilization, but it wasn't always readily available in the right places or quantities. Without an organised and efficient water delivery system, ancient empires would have been unable to sustain large populations, build monumental cities, or even feed their armies. Picture yourself as a water carrier in ancient Rome or Athens. You wake up before dawn, the air still cool, and prepare for your day of hauling heavy water vessels. With a large jar slung over your shoulder or balanced on a yoke across your back, you begin your journey to the nearest fountain or well. The sun rises as you walk to the outskirts of the city, navigating through crowded streets where merchants, soldiers, and farmers are already at work. As you fill your vessel, you can feel the weight of the water pushing down on your back. Then, it's time to make the long trek back, often carrying multiple jars at once to satisfy the needs of several households. This was an everyday task for thousands of workers who kept the flow of water alive in ancient cities. The job of the water carrier was far from easy. Water was a precious commodity, and the carriers were responsible for fetching it from distant wells, fountains, or rivers, and delivering it to homes, baths, and public buildings. In ancient Rome, for example, the wealthy might have had a direct connection to one of the city's many aqueducts, which brought fresh water from miles away. But for most people, water had to be carried by hand. The water carrier often spent hours each day filling and hauling heavy jars, sometimes traversing long distances just to keep the daily life of the city flowing. But the water carrier wasn't just about hauling water, they were also the keepers of the water supply. In ancient civilizations, where the threat of droughts, flooding and water contamination loomed large, the role of the water carrier was crucial for maintaining the health and safety of the population. Without them, disease could spread through a lack of access to clean water, and cities would quickly run out of the essential resource needed to survive. As the ancient world's water infrastructure grew more advanced, the role of the water carrier became even more important. They worked alongside engineers who built the complex systems of aqueducts and wells that brought water to the urban centres. The carriers, in turn, were responsible for ensuring that water reached the right places at the right time. One fascinating aspect of water carriers in ancient Rome was their role in maintaining the baths. Roman baths were a central feature of daily life, places for socialising, relaxing and conducting business. These public baths required enormous quantities of water, which had to be constantly supplied and heated. The water carriers were responsible for ensuring that the baths had enough fresh water to keep the pools full and the heating systems working. They worked tirelessly, often well into the night, filling reservoirs and pipes that would feed the grand public baths. But it wasn't just the elite that relied on water carriers. In many ancient societies, the role of the water carrier was one that cut across all social classes. In ancient Egypt, for instance, workers who built the pyramids or toiled in the fields would rely on water carriers to bring them cool, fresh water to drink during their long, grueling hours of labour. Water carriers were also essential for farmers who relied on them to water crops and maintain irrigation systems. Water was so critical to life that even the poorest citizens needed access to it in order to survive. While the water carriers played a crucial role in maintaining the daily rhythm of life, their work was often taken for granted. In many societies, they were seen as low-status workers, often slaves or labourers. However, their work was invaluable. Without water carriers, no ancient civilization could have thrived. The rise of cities, the development of agriculture, the expansion of trade, all of these were made possible by the tireless work of these invisible everyday heroes. Despite their critical role, water carriers rarely received recognition for their contributions. It wasn't the carriers who were honoured in royal decrees or celebrated in grand monuments. It was the kings and generals. Yet, the very existence of these empires relied on the steady supply of water that these workers ensured. Historians still debate the social standing of the water carrier in ancient societies. Were they seen as essential but humble servants of the people, or were they often overlooked and treated with disdain? Some scholars suggest that the lowly status of water carriers reflected the broader social hierarchies in ancient societies, where manual labour was often undervalued. Others believe that the carriers were considered a vital part of the community, with some cultures recognising their contributions more than others. In any case, the work of the water carrier was essential to the survival of ancient civilizations, and their efforts should not be forgotten. An interesting tidbit about ancient water carriers is that in many cultures, the work was often gendered. In ancient Rome, for example, it was primarily women and children who carried water for households, especially in poorer areas of the city. In contrast, in Egypt, men typically took on the task of hauling water from the Nile to the fields. This division of labour reveals much about the social structure of ancient societies, where gender roles were often rigidly defined, and certain tasks were considered more appropriate for men or women. Historians still argue about the exact methods used by water carriers to transport water across ancient cities. Did they use a series of jars and baskets, or did they employ more sophisticated tools like wheeled carts or boats in rivers? Some scholars suggest that water carriers used complex networks of aqueducts, channels, and pipes to transport water through cities. Others point out that much of the water transportation was still done by hand, making the work even more physically demanding. Regardless of the specific methods, the role of the water carrier was undeniably critical to the functioning of ancient cities. Without their work, the advanced urban centres that defined these civilizations would have simply collapsed. Ultimately, the work of the water carriers provides an important reminder of how much we depend on the invisible, everyday labour that makes civilization possible. We often take for granted the access to clean water that we enjoy today, but in ancient times, it was a luxury that required a great deal of effort to maintain, and it was the water carriers, often working in the shadows, who ensured that water flowed through the veins of these great empires. As we continue to explore the invisible workforce that sustained ancient empires, let's now turn to a group that often operates in the shadows but holds incredible importance: healers. The medical practitioners of the ancient world, whether they were doctors, herbalists, or midwives, provided the essential service of maintaining health and preventing disease in a time when medicine was rudimentary and often shrouded in mystery. The healers of ancient societies were essential in ensuring the well-being of both ordinary citizens and rulers, yet their contributions often went unacknowledged in historical accounts, especially when compared to the more celebrated warriors or kings. Imagine yourself as an ancient healer. Maybe you're a practitioner in Mesopotamia or a midwife in Greece. It's early morning, and the soft glow of the sun filters through the modest wooden windows of your dwelling. You're preparing your tools for the day: a bundle of herbs, a bowl of oils, and perhaps a collection of potions and ointments you've carefully concocted over the years. Your job isn't just about curing ailments. It's about providing comfort, care, and healing to those in need. The work you do is far from glamorous, and it often goes unnoticed, but you are a cornerstone of society. Without you, the empire wouldn't thrive. The role of healers in ancient civilizations was crucial, yet often mysterious. In ancient Egypt, for example, healing was intertwined with religion. Many doctors were also priests who invoked the help of gods like Thoth, the god of healing, to cure ailments. Medical knowledge was passed down in temples, where scribes recorded prescriptions and remedies on papyrus scrolls. Egyptian medicine was advanced for its time, with treatments for ailments such as infections, broken bones, and even dental issues. Still, despite the advancements, there was a strong belief that many illnesses were caused by spiritual imbalances, and healing often involved rituals or prayers in addition to herbal treatments. Similarly, in ancient Mesopotamia, healers worked with a combination of herbal remedies and divine interventions. The famous Sumerian text known as the Code of Hammurabi contains laws related to medical practice, including fees for doctors and penalties for botched treatments. Healers were often highly respected, but their methods were far from the scientific practices we have today. Treatments could involve prayer, sacrifices to the gods, and the use of incantations along with herbal remedies, some of which were surprisingly effective. Ancient Mesopotamian doctors also performed surgical procedures, including trepanation, removing parts of the skull, to treat head injuries, although the risks involved were high. In ancient Greece, healing reached another level of sophistication. The Greeks are often credited with being the founders of medicine as we know it. Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, revolutionized the field by advocating for naturalistic explanations for disease, rather than attributing illness solely to the will of the gods. His approach emphasized observation, diagnosis, and treatment based on the body's natural processes. However, while Hippocrates is often seen as the pioneer of rational medicine, the majority of medical practitioners were still working with limited knowledge and were closely tied to religious and superstitious beliefs. Healers in ancient Greece would use herbs, diet, and rest to treat ailments, but they also relied on prayer and rituals to appease the gods and restore balance. As we look at ancient Rome, the healing profession grew even more organized. Roman medicine was a blend of Greek medical traditions and practical Roman military experience. Roman soldiers, for example, relied heavily on field medics and surgeons to treat injuries, particularly during wartime. Roman medical practitioners, known as medici, had a variety of tools at their disposal, from surgical instruments to ointments and poultices. The Roman army in particular had a sophisticated system for treating wounds, setting bones, and even performing amputations when necessary. Healers and doctors in Rome were often trained in medical schools or through apprenticeships, but like their counterparts in Egypt and Mesopotamia, they also had to rely on a mix of reason and ritual. In ancient China, healing took on a unique form. Chinese medicine was based on the belief that the body was governed by the balance of vital energies, known as qi or qi. Practitioners of Chinese medicine, known as healers or doctors, used a combination of herbal remedies, acupuncture and massage to treat ailments. The most famous of these practitioners was the legendary physician Hua Tuo, who is credited with developing early forms of anesthesia and performing surgeries. Traditional Chinese medicine also had a deeply spiritual component, with healers focusing not only on treating physical ailments, but also on ensuring spiritual and emotional balance. The Chinese were also pioneers in the development of medical texts, some of which are still influential today. While the ancient healers were incredibly skilled in their respective traditions, their work was often undervalued by the elites of society. In some cases, healers were seen as lower-class workers, and their contributions went unrecognized. It's a common thread in history that those who are responsible for the health and well-being of societies are often overlooked when the great achievements of civilizations are discussed. Healers didn't lead armies or build monuments, and they didn't acquire wealth or fame. Yet, without them, the empires would not have been able to function. Interestingly, historians still debate the ethical practices of ancient medicine. Were healers providing genuine care, or were they taking advantage of superstitions and ignorance? While some treatments were certainly effective, many others were based on misconceptions about the body and illness. Modern scholars often wonder how much ancient medicine was genuinely beneficial, and how much was influenced by cultural beliefs and religious practices. There's also the question of whether ancient healers truly understood the causes of diseases. Were they just guessing, or were they actually performing valuable medical work despite their limited knowledge? One quirky tidbit is that some ancient healers used unconventional materials in their treatments. In ancient Egypt, for example, honey was used for its antibacterial properties to treat wounds. Similarly, in Rome, gladiators who were treated for injuries often used mixtures of vinegar and salt to cleanse their wounds. Surprisingly effective, given the limited medical knowledge of the time. In other parts of the ancient world, treatments could involve strange remedies such as crocodile dung for birth control, or the application of snake venom to treat certain ailments. Despite these debates, one thing is clear: ancient healers were indispensable to the survival of these civilizations. Their work kept armies healthy, ensured the fertility of the population, and prevented the spread of disease. Without them, the mighty empires of Egypt, Greece, Rome, and others would have crumbled long before their time. While we might not remember their names or their methods today, the contributions of healers were just as crucial as those of the warriors, architects, and rulers who typically take the spotlight in history books. Let's move now to another invisible group whose work shaped the spiritual and political landscape of ancient civilizations: the priests and temple staff. In nearly every ancient society, religion wasn't just a personal matter, it was the glue that held the entire empire together. From the massive Egyptian temples to the Roman forums, the ancient world was built on rituals, beliefs, and practices that often required a dedicated group of priests and attendants to carry them out. These individuals didn't wield swords or crowns, but their work was crucial in maintaining the social order, political stability, and divine favour that kept the empire functioning. Imagine stepping into a temple in ancient Egypt, your feet echoing across the cool stone floor as you enter the grand hall, adorned with towering statues of gods and inscribed with hieroglyphs that tell stories of divine power. As a priest, you begin your day early, well before dawn, preparing for the rituals that will honour the gods. The air is thick with incense, and the light filtering through the columns casts a serene glow on the sacred offerings placed on the altar. You may not be able to see the political machinations that go on behind closed doors, but you know that your role is just as essential. The prosperity of the empire depends on your ability to maintain the favour of the gods, which in turn ensures the empire's continued existence. In ancient Egypt, priests were believed to be the intermediaries between the gods and the people. Their roles were both spiritual and political, as they had the power to influence kings, shape laws, and determine the fate of individuals. The temple was more than just a place of worship. It was a hub of power. Priests performed daily rituals to honour the gods, offered sacrifices, and conducted divination to predict the future. They also played a role in administering the wealth of the temple, which was often vast, and used these resources to support the religious and political elite. Priests were highly respected in ancient Egyptian society, but their work wasn't easy. It was not simply about performing rituals or making offerings. They had to maintain the temple, care for sacred objects, and ensure that the temple's finances were in order. In many ways, they were the custodians of the empire's religious and economic stability. Without them, the temples would not have been able to function, and the gods' favour would have been lost. This was no small matter. If the gods were displeased, famine, war, or disaster could strike. In ancient Mesopotamia, the role of the priest was just as central to society. Priests in Sumer and Babylon not only conducted religious ceremonies, but also held administrative power. The temples were often the centre of the city, and the priests were responsible for managing the agricultural surplus, overseeing trade, and even keeping records. The ziggurats, massive stepped pyramids, were not just religious centres, they were also the administrative hubs where the priests kept track of the wealth and resources of the city-state. The priests controlled the distribution of grain, textiles and other goods, making them the power brokers behind the political stage. Priests in Mesopotamia also played a key role in divination, interpreting the will of the gods to advise kings and rulers. They would study the movement of the stars, the entrails of animals, and even the patterns in the weather to predict the future. Their role was so important that the fate of a kingdom could rest on the accuracy of their predictions. And while the priests themselves were not kings, they often wielded more influence than the monarchs they served, especially during times of political instability. In ancient Greece, the role of the priest was less centralized than in Egypt or Mesopotamia, but it was no less important. Greek temples were spread across the land, and priests performed sacrifices, prayers, and other rituals to honor the gods. While the priests themselves didn't hold political power in the same way as their Egyptian or Mesopotamian counterparts, they played a critical role in the religious and social fabric of Greek life. Festivals, athletic games, and theatrical performances were often held in honor of the gods, with priests leading the ceremonies and ensuring that the gods were pleased. The Roman Empire took a slightly different approach to religion, but priests still held great importance. Roman religion was a blend of civic duty and personal devotion. The pontiffs, the most powerful priests in Rome, were responsible for overseeing the religious calendar, ensuring that proper rituals were observed and maintaining the favour of the gods. Like their counterparts in Egypt and Mesopotamia, Roman priests played an integral role in the political landscape. The emperor himself was often considered a divine figure, and the rituals performed by priests ensured that the emperor's reign was blessed by the gods. Despite the power they wielded, priests and temple staff were not always the glamorous figures they are often depicted as today. Their lives were filled with long hours, strict rituals, and heavy responsibilities. They were often required to adhere to rigid codes of conduct and dress, and their personal lives were subject to scrutiny. Many priests took vows of celibacy or other forms of personal sacrifice to ensure their devotion to the gods. These individuals, while not always celebrated in history, were the ones who held society together, ensuring that the temples continued to function and that the spiritual needs of the people were met. Historians still debate the exact social status of priests in ancient societies. Were they the spiritual leaders of the people, or were they more like political power brokers, maintaining control over the resources and wealth of the temples? Some scholars argue that priests were primarily spiritual guides, while others contend that they wielded significant political influence, often using their power to shape the course of history. What is clear, however, is that their work was indispensable. Without the priests and temple staff, the religious and political systems of ancient civilizations would have collapsed. An interesting tidbit about ancient priests is their role in ensuring the agricultural success of the empire. In many societies, the success of the harvest was believed to be tied directly to the favour of the gods, and the priests were responsible for making offerings to ensure a bountiful crop. In ancient Egypt, for example, the annual flooding of the Nile River, which brought water and nutrients to the land, was seen as a gift from the gods. Priests performed rituals to honour the gods and ensure that the river would flood at the right time, guaranteeing a good harvest. Historians still argue about the exact relationship between priests and rulers in ancient societies. Were priests the true power behind the throne, using their influence to shape political decisions? Or were they simply religious figures, following the orders of the kings and emperors they served? While there is no definitive answer, it's clear that the work of priests and temple staff was essential in keeping the empires running. They may not have been the ones who led armies or made laws, but without them, the very foundations of these civilizations would have crumbled. As we continue our exploration of the unseen workers who sustained ancient empires, it's time to shine a light on an often overlooked group, the guards and defenders of ancient cities. These were the men and women tasked with the responsibility of protecting the most valuable assets of the empire, the people, the leaders, and the infrastructure that made the empire strong. While generals and military commanders may have taken the spotlight in historical accounts, it was the silent presence of the guards who stood at the gates, patrolled the walls, and protected the borders that kept ancient civilizations from falling to external threats. Imagine the scene. The city is quiet at dusk, the sky bathed in hues of purple and gold as the sun sets. You, a palace guard in ancient Persia, stand at your post outside the royal citadel, the weight of your spear heavy in your hand. The city sprawls below, its vibrant streets filled with merchants, civilians, and soldiers. But your focus is unwavering. Your duty is to ensure the safety of the king and the royal family no matter the cost. You stand as a silent sentinel guarding the entrance to the heart of the empire. If the city falls, so does the empire. The work you do may be invisible to the masses, but without you, the entire structure of the empire could collapse. In ancient civilizations, the role of the guard was multifaceted. Guards were responsible not only for protecting the city from invaders, but also for maintaining order within the city itself. In ancient Rome, for example, the cohortes urbanae, urban cohorts, were tasked with keeping the peace in Rome's sprawling streets. Their duties went beyond guarding the gates. They were responsible for ensuring that the common people did not riot, that criminals were apprehended, and that the emperor's law was upheld. The role of guards was crucial in times of war, but their duties extended into times of peace as well. In ancient Egypt, for example, the royal guard had the task of ensuring the safety of the pharaoh, who was seen as a divine figure. The pharaoh's safety was tied directly to the health of the empire itself. The guards not only stood at the royal palace, but also accompanied the pharaoh on military campaigns, ensuring that their king remained untouched by enemy forces. These guards were often elite soldiers, chosen for their loyalty and skill, and they served as the ultimate protectors of the divine ruler. One of the most iconic examples of ancient guards was the famed Immortals of the Persian Empire. The Immortals were an elite unit of soldiers who guarded the king and served as shock troops in battle. Their name comes from their ability to always maintain a full force of 10,000 soldiers. When one soldier died, he was immediately replaced. This remarkable force symbolized the strength and unity of the Persian Empire, and their presence sent a clear message to anyone who might consider challenging the empire's power. But while the Immortals were highly visible in battle, their everyday work as guards was less glamorous. They stood at the gates of the king's palace, ensuring that no harm came to the ruler and maintained a watchful eye over the empire's borders. In Rome, the role of the guard was closely tied to the political landscape. The Praetorian Guard, for example, was responsible for protecting the emperor and his family. These elite soldiers were often highly influential in Roman politics, as they had the power to make or break emperors. In fact, the Praetorian Guard was responsible for several infamous moments in Roman history, including the assassination of emperors and the installation of new ones. While the Praetorian Guard played an important role in maintaining the empire's political stability, their power sometimes extended too far, leading to corruption and political intrigue. The work of the guards was not just limited to the royal courts or political leaders. In many ancient civilizations, guards also protected the borders and frontiers of empires, keeping invaders and hostile forces at bay. Roman legions, for instance, were stationed across the empire, guarding important roads, fortresses, and trade routes. These guards were essential in ensuring the empire's expansion and the protection of its resources. They stood watch over the boundaries of the empire, making sure that enemies did not breach the walls, and that the empire's wealth and people remained safe. One of the most iconic representations of ancient guards is the Great Wall of China. The soldiers who manned the wall were tasked with defending the Chinese empire from nomadic tribes and invaders from the north. These soldiers, often stationed in isolated outposts along the wall, were among the most dedicated and resilient soldiers in history. They lived in harsh conditions, braving the cold winters and the constant threat of attack. The guards who watched over the Great Wall are often romanticized in Chinese history as symbols of patriotism and loyalty. But their work, though crucial, was often grueling and thankless. They did not receive the same recognition as the generals who led campaigns, but without them, the empire would have been vulnerable to invasion. Historians still debate whether the guards in ancient civilizations were ever truly acknowledged for their contributions. Were they seen as heroes, or were they simply the foot soldiers in the grand scheme of empire building? Some scholars argue that guards were essential to the stability of ancient societies and should have received more recognition. Others contend that they were often overlooked, their contributions seen as mere routine work that didn't warrant much praise. Regardless of their status, one thing is clear. Without the guards, the empire could not have functioned. Their silent vigilance ensured the safety and continuity of civilization, making them an indispensable part of the ancient world. An interesting tidbit about the ancient guards is their uniforms. In many ancient civilizations, the uniform worn by the guards was a symbol of their status and role within society. Roman soldiers, for example, wore distinctive armor and helmets, which made them easily recognizable. The armor was not just for protection, it was also a visual representation of the soldier's importance and allegiance to the emperor. In ancient Egypt, royal guards often wore elaborate linen robes and adorned their heads with headdresses, which marked them as elite members of the king's service. The uniform served as a constant reminder of the power they were sworn to protect. Historians still argue whether the guards of ancient civilizations ever truly understood the weight of their responsibility. Were they aware that their vigilance was what held the empire together, or were they just doing their jobs as routine as any other? Some believe that the guards were deeply aware of their importance and took great pride in their duties. Others suggest that many guards were simply carrying out orders, performing their jobs with little fanfare or recognition. Yet, no matter their mindset, the role of the guard was critical to the survival of these empires, and without them, the ancient world would have looked very different. Now, let's explore the crucial but often invisible work done by a group of workers who played a key role in the intricate communication systems of ancient empires: the couriers. These were the messengers who carried vital information across vast distances, ensuring that the rulers, military commanders, and administrators remained connected with their far-flung territories. While we tend to think of couriers as a more modern concept, their role was just as essential to the survival of ancient civilizations, from the Roman Empire to the Persian Empire and beyond. These individuals didn't wield power, but without them, the empire would have crumbled under the weight of distance and isolation. Imagine being one of these ancient couriers, standing on the edge of a vast desert or deep in a thick forest. It's early morning, and you've been preparing for your journey for days. Your pack is light, just enough to carry the urgent letters or orders entrusted to you. You've been given specific instructions. Deliver these messages safely to the governor in the next province, or to the general commanding troops on the border. The roads ahead may be treacherous, and the weather unforgiving, but you know that the success of an entire military campaign or the stability of an empire could depend on the messages you carry. In ancient Persia, the use of couriers was legendary. The royal road, stretching over 500 miles from Susa to Sardis, was one of the most well-maintained communication networks of the ancient world. Persian couriers, known for their speed and efficiency, could travel the length of the empire in a matter of days, using a system of relay stations where fresh horses awaited them. This system allowed messages to travel at extraordinary speeds for the time, facilitating communication between the king, military leaders, and governors. The Persian Empire relied heavily on these couriers to maintain control over its vast territories, making sure that every corner of the empire received royal decrees, military orders, and news of battles and victories. The Roman Empire, similarly, had an extensive postal system that relied on couriers to carry official messages and documents across its vast roads and highways. The cursus publicus, the state-run courier and transportation system, was essential to maintaining the empire's authority. Roman couriers were highly trained and disciplined. They were responsible not only for delivering messages, but also for maintaining the empire's infrastructure, ensuring that roads were in good condition and that supplies could flow freely between provinces. They travelled on horseback or by foot, sometimes crossing dangerous terrain and often at great personal risk. For the empire, these couriers were the lifeline that kept it functioning. The role of the courier wasn't confined to military or administrative messages. In ancient Egypt, couriers were responsible for transporting goods, including tribute and resources, between the capital and the provinces. The message was often conveyed in the form of royal decrees, but it wasn't just about communication. It was about ensuring that the logistical side of the empire operated smoothly. The Egyptian courier system ensured that food, raw materials, and even luxury goods flowed freely, supporting both the administration and the elite. Couriers also helped maintain the empire's religious infrastructure by delivering instructions for temple rituals and ceremonies, linking the sacred and the secular worlds. An often overlooked part of the ancient courier system was the role of the chasquis in the Inca Empire. The chasquis were highly trained runners, part of an elite group of messengers who carried messages, orders, and goods across the Andes. Their journey would take them across the mountainous terrain, over dangerous paths, and through villages, where they would pass the messages on to the next runner in a relay system. The Inca Empire didn't use written language as we know it, but the chasquis were essential in maintaining the flow of communication and resources, relying on an intricate system of runners to deliver critical information from the capital to every corner of the empire. The Inca also had a network of storage facilities where couriers would drop off goods and food to be distributed, ensuring that the empire's vast network could thrive. Historians still debate the exact organisation and logistics of these ancient courier systems. How exactly did they manage such vast distances with such efficiency? Were the couriers simply part of a military or bureaucratic machine, or did they possess some form of specialised training that set them apart? Some scholars argue that the system was a well-oiled machine, with each courier receiving detailed instructions and following strict protocols. Others believe that the courier systems relied on improvisation and adaptability, as couriers faced constantly changing conditions and unpredictable environments. One interesting and quirky tidbit about ancient couriers is the way messages were often encoded. In ancient Rome, for example, military messages were sometimes written using a form of cipher called the Caesar cipher, named after Julius Caesar, who reportedly used it to encode military communications. This cipher involved shifting the letters of the alphabet by a set number, ensuring that only those with the key could read the message. Similar forms of encryption were used throughout the ancient world, including in Persia and China, where written messages were sometimes protected by codes or seals to prevent them from falling into the wrong hands. Couriers also faced dangers on their journeys. In ancient Egypt, for example, a courier carrying important messages across the desert would be at the mercy of the elements. In ancient Rome, couriers on long-distance trips could encounter robbers or bandits lurking in the wilderness, ready to ambush and steal the valuable messages they carried. The work was not only physically demanding but also perilous, and the couriers often worked under tight deadlines to deliver their messages on time. Despite their crucial role, couriers were rarely celebrated or remembered in the grand narrative of history. They didn't lead armies or build monuments. Their names weren't carved into stone or recorded in annals. They were, however, indispensable. Without couriers, the vast empires of the ancient world would have struggled to function. Political decisions would have been delayed, armies would have been out of sync, and empires would have been isolated from each other, making the vast, interconnected world of ancient civilizations impossible. Historians still argue whether the role of the courier was more about speed or accuracy. Did the courier's ability to deliver messages quickly outweigh the accuracy of the information? Or was it more important to ensure that the message was delivered perfectly? What we do know for certain is that the efficiency and dedication of these couriers were critical to the smooth operation of ancient empires. They may not have been the faces of history, but they were the silent bearers of power and communication, and without them, the ancient world would have been a much quieter place. Let's now shift our focus to another invisible group that played a significant role in keeping the ancient world functioning: the food tasters. This seemingly peculiar job, while not glamorous, was of immense importance in ensuring the health and safety of rulers, elites, and sometimes entire populations. The role of food tasters is often romanticized in stories, but in reality it was a dangerous and often thankless job, yet one that was essential in preventing poisonings and ensuring that the royal table remained safe. Imagine yourself in ancient Rome or Persia, seated at the royal table or in the kitchen of a noble household. You're one of the trusted food tasters, tasked with ensuring that every dish is safe to eat before it is served to the emperor, king, or other elite individuals. As the food is presented, you carefully take a small bite, your heart racing slightly as you wait. The food may look fine, but you know that poison is a constant threat, particularly to those who wield the power of the empire. You swallow carefully, and only once you've confirmed that the dish is free from toxins will you give the signal for it to be served. It's a dangerous job, one where your life is quite literally on the line, but it is also an indispensable one for maintaining the health of the elite. In ancient Rome, food tasters were often employed by the emperor and the imperial court. They were selected for their loyalty, quick reflexes, and their ability to withstand poison. In a time when poisoning was a common method of assassination, the food taster's role was a critical part of the palace's security measures. Roman emperors, particularly those like Nero and Caligula, had a constant fear of being poisoned, and thus food tasters were often on duty at all times, testing everything from wine to meats before the emperor took a bite. The role was not just about personal safety, it was about maintaining the stability of the empire. Without the food tasters, a single poisoned meal could have been disastrous, leading to the downfall of the ruler and potentially destabilizing the entire region. The position of the royal food taster wasn't exclusive to Rome, it was widespread in ancient Persia as well. The Persian kings, like their Roman counterparts, were frequently at risk of poisoning by rivals, enemies, or even close family members. Persian food tasters would perform the same duties, often testing the food before the king and his family ate. Interestingly, food tasters in ancient Persia were not just trusted with food safety, they were often trained in etiquette and social protocols as well, serving as advisors of sorts during royal feasts and gatherings. They were not only the first line of defence against poisoning, but they also had a ceremonial role, ensuring that the royal table was prepared with respect and decorum. Interestingly, food tasters were not always in the background. Some, especially in cultures like Persia and Egypt, gained significant prestige due to the dangerous nature of their work. In ancient Egypt, high-ranking food tasters who served the pharaoh or noble families were seen as trusted figures and often wielded significant influence. They were not only responsible for food safety, but also for managing the preparation of elaborate feasts and banquets, which were central to the political and religious life of the empire. Food tasters in Egypt sometimes performed roles in organising the ceremonial aspects of meals, ensuring that offerings were presented correctly and that the gods were honoured through the proper ritualistic preparations. Food tasters were often regarded with a mix of admiration and fear. While their role was vital, their work was also extremely risky. Ancient texts and records describe the various poisons that were commonly used in royal courts, ranging from plant-based toxins like hemlock to animal venoms. Even a seemingly harmless dish could hide a lethal threat. The most dangerous poisons were often slow-acting, taking hours or even days to reveal their effects, meaning that a food taster's job wasn't limited to a simple taste test. It required vigilance and knowledge of symptoms. Some emperors and rulers even went so far as to have their food tasters test not only the food itself, but also the utensils, the cups, and even the air to ensure that there was no hidden danger. Historians still debate the actual number of royal food tasters employed by ancient rulers. Some suggest that in the wealthiest courts, food tasters could have been a team of individuals, each responsible for different courses of the meal, while others argue that the position was typically held by one trusted individual. In either case, the task was more than just a job. It was a sign of the high level of trust the ruler had in the taster's loyalty and ability to survive the dangers that came with the role. In many ways, the life of a food taster was a paradox. Though they were protected by the rulers they served, they were also at the constant mercy of those same rulers. If a food taster failed to detect poison, the consequences could be severe, not just for the taster, but for the entire palace or household. Some food tasters were even executed if they failed in their duties, or if they were suspected of complicity in an assassination attempt. This made the role even more precarious, as it was not just about serving the food, but also about surviving in a highly charged, often deadly political environment. One quirky tidbit about ancient food tasters is the notion that they sometimes developed immunity to certain poisons. Over time, it was believed that some food tasters might develop a resistance to low levels of poison, either through gradual exposure or by ingesting small, controlled amounts of toxic substances. This would make the work somewhat safer, but it also meant that food tasters lived with a constant risk of poisoning, whether from their duties or from someone seeking to take advantage of their role. Historians still argue whether food tasters truly played as central a role, as is often suggested in popular media, or if their function was overblown in ancient texts. Did the emperors of ancient Rome and Persia rely on food tasters more out of paranoia than necessity? Some scholars argue that poisoning, while certainly a risk, was not as common as the historical accounts suggest, and that food tasters may have been a largely ceremonial role. However, the consistent presence of food tasters in royal courts across many ancient civilizations points to their true importance in keeping the royal families safe and secure. Ultimately, the food tasters of ancient empires represent the hidden, often dangerous work of those who lived on the fringes of the royal court, ensuring that those who wielded power could do so safely. While their names may not be remembered in the grand history books, their role was integral to the survival of the empire. Without their vigilance, royal courts could have fallen victim to the silent but deadly threat of poisoning, and the empire's stability might have been undermined. Let's now turn our attention to another essential yet frequently overlooked group of workers in ancient empires, the weavers. These craftsmen and women, though often invisible in the grand historical narrative, were the silent creators of the textiles that played a fundamental role in ancient trade, fashion, and even warfare. From the intricately woven garments worn by the elite to the durable fabrics used in the military, the work of the weaver was an integral part of the functioning of ancient civilizations. providing not just clothing, but a tangible reflection of social status, economic power, and cultural identity. Imagine yourself in the bustling markets of ancient Egypt or Rome, or sitting in a humble workshop surrounded by looms and spools of yarn. You are a weaver, meticulously crafting the fabric that will be worn by both the elite and the common people. The rhythmic sound of the loom is soothing as you weave intricate patterns into the fabric, your hands moving with practiced precision. The designs you create will be worn by the wealthy at grand feasts, while simpler fabrics will be sold in markets for everyday use. But your work is not just about producing clothing. It is about creating something that holds cultural significance, a tangible expression of the empire's wealth and identity. Weaving in ancient civilizations was far from a simple task. It involved skill, patience, and often an intricate understanding of design and colour. In ancient Egypt, for instance, linen was the fabric of choice for clothing. Egyptian weavers used flax, which was grown along the banks of the Nile to create their fabrics. The weavers would take great care to spin the flax into threads, then weave them into cloth using a hand-operated loom. Linen was prized not only for its lightness and breathability, but also for its fine texture, which was associated with the purity and wealth of the elite. The Egyptian weavers were responsible for producing not only everyday garments, but also the intricate tapestries and ceremonial robes worn by the pharaohs and priests. These garments were often richly decorated, woven with patterns that symbolized the gods and the divine right of the pharaohs. Linen was so highly valued that it was used in religious ceremonies, where priests wore elaborate linen garments as a sign of their purity and their closeness to the gods. Weaving, therefore, was more than just a craft. It was a sacred art, linking the everyday life of the people with the spiritual life of the empire. In ancient Greece and Rome, the role of the weaver was just as vital, though the fabrics they worked with were different. In Greece, wool was commonly used, and weavers were responsible for creating the distinctive clothing worn by Greek citizens, such as the chiton, a loose-fitting tunic worn by both men and women. The Romans, too, relied on wool for their garments, although linen was also common, especially for the wealthy. Roman weavers were often highly skilled, creating garments that were both functional and decorative, with elaborate designs woven into the fabric to signify status and rank. Wealthy Romans would wear garments made from fine wool, while the poorer citizens often wore simpler, coarser fabrics. Interestingly, weaving also had a military function in ancient Rome. The Roman legions needed a constant supply of fabric for their tents, banners, and military uniforms. Weavers were tasked with creating durable, functional fabrics that could withstand the harsh conditions of battle. The tunics worn by Roman soldiers, for example, were made from simple woolen cloth, but they were essential for the functionality of the military. Soldiers' armour was often paired with a linen or woolen tunic, which could absorb sweat and provide some protection against the elements. Weaving, in this context, was not just an art. It was a matter of military strategy, ensuring that the legions were equipped with the materials they needed to maintain their dominance. In China, the weaver's role was similarly essential to the empire's economy and identity. The Chinese were pioneers in silk production, and the art of silk weaving was closely guarded by the imperial family. The emperor's court demanded the finest silks, which were often woven with intricate patterns and designs, showcasing the wealth and sophistication of the ruling class. Silk was a highly prized commodity, and the process of weaving it required specialized knowledge. The silk trade would later become one of the most lucrative and significant industries in China, as merchants sold this luxurious fabric along the Silk Road, reaching as far as the Roman Empire. Historians still debate the true extent of the social status of weavers in ancient societies. Some scholars argue that weavers were highly respected, especially in cultures where textiles were considered a sign of wealth and status, while others believed that they were seen as low-status labourers, despite the importance of their work. In Egypt, weavers who worked in the royal courts were often given prestigious positions, but those who worked for the general population or in the lower classes had far less recognition. In Greece and Rome, the weavers who produced the finest garments for the elites were sometimes regarded as skilled craftsmen, while those who worked on simpler textiles were likely viewed as lower-class workers. One interesting aspect of ancient weaving that still sparks debate is the use of weaving patterns to convey cultural and political messages. In many societies, the patterns woven into the fabric had symbolic meanings. In ancient Greece, for example, certain motifs were used to represent the gods or key aspects of Greek mythology. In Egypt, the designs on the pharaoh's ceremonial robes often included symbols of divine power and the eternal life of the ruler. Some historians argue that weaving in this sense was more than just a craft. It was a form of communication, an art that conveyed the political and religious ideologies of the empire. In fact, one quirky tidbit is the ancient belief that weaving was associated with fate itself. In both Greek and Roman mythology, the fates were often depicted as women who wove the threads of life. They were said to spin, measure, and cut the threads of each person's existence, determining their destiny. This connection between weaving and fate symbolized the importance of the craft and its spiritual significance. It was no coincidence that the gods themselves were sometimes depicted with spinning wheels, reinforcing the idea that weaving was not just a mundane task, it was an act with cosmic significance. Historians still argue about the exact role of the weaver in the broader context of the ancient economy. Were they simply producing commodities for trade, or were they deeply intertwined with the empire's cultural and political fabric? While the work of the weaver may have been invisible to many, the impact of their craft is undeniable. Textiles were not just everyday items, they were a powerful symbol of status, identity, and the economic strength of the empire. Whether weaving luxurious silk for the Emperor of China or crafting functional woolen garments for Roman soldiers, weavers played a pivotal role in the life of ancient empires, and their work continues to echo through history. As we explore the often unseen work that sustained ancient empires, let's turn to another essential, though largely invisible role, the merchants. These traders, while often relegated to the background in historical accounts, were the lifeblood of ancient economies. Without them, the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture between distant lands would have been impossible. Merchants played a key role not only in the economic prosperity of empires, but also in the diffusion of technology, art, and knowledge that helped shape the ancient world. Imagine yourself as a merchant in ancient Babylon, Persia, or Rome. Your day begins early as you prepare your goods for trade, luxury textiles, spices, metals, pottery, or grains. You gather your caravan or ship packed with valuable commodities, ready to embark on the long journey that will take you across deserts, through cities, and over vast seas. Your trade route is established, but the path ahead is fraught with challenges. Robbers, natural obstacles, and even the occasional pirate could threaten your cargo. Yet, you press on, knowing that your trade goods are essential to sustaining the empire's economy, and that your success is what keeps the flow of resources running smoothly. In ancient Rome, merchants were the backbone of the empire's trade network. Rome's extensive road system, the VAE, facilitated the movement of goods across its vast territories. Roman merchants didn't just deal in physical goods, they were also responsible for creating networks of information. They communicated across distances, helping to spread news, cultures, and ideas. They brought luxury goods, such as fine silks from China, spices from India, and wine from Gaul, to the heart of the empire. These goods were not only valuable for their practical uses, but were symbols of status and wealth. The Romans, and later the Byzantine Empire, had an expansive market system that allowed merchants to trade across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Their role was essential in maintaining the flow of not just commodities, but the empire's cultural and social cohesion. In ancient Greece, merchants were integral to the city-state economy. Greek merchants traded not just goods, but also ideas. Many of the early philosophical texts, artworks, and scientific discoveries were carried by merchants travelling between Athens, Alexandria, and other ancient cities. Merchants in ancient Greece weren't just business people, they were the carriers of civilization. They brought back knowledge from Egypt, Persia, and India, and this exchange was crucial to the intellectual and cultural growth of the Greek world. The Silk Road, which spanned from China through Central Asia and into the Roman Empire, is perhaps the most famous example of ancient trade. Merchants who travelled along this route didn't just exchange material goods like silk, spices, and precious metals. They also facilitated the exchange of knowledge, religious ideas, and technology. The impact of the Silk Road on ancient civilizations was profound, helping to establish the foundations for later global trade routes and cross-cultural exchanges. In ancient Egypt, merchants also played a significant role in the empire's prosperity. Egypt's wealth was built on trade, especially in gold, grain, and papyrus, which were in high demand across the ancient world. Egyptian merchants travelled along the Nile River, across the Mediterranean, and to the lands of Nubia and Punt. Their trade routes connected Egypt to the wider world, and their goods found their way into the homes of the elite in the Near East and Mediterranean. Egypt's extensive trade networks were not only vital for economic survival, but also helped spread the empire's cultural influence throughout the ancient world. In the Persian Empire, merchants formed a crucial part of the administration's ability to manage and control such a vast empire. With trade routes stretching from the Indus Valley in the east to Anatolia in the west, Persia's merchants facilitated the exchange of goods and information across multiple regions. Persian merchants were well known for their ability to navigate the complex political landscapes of the time, acting as intermediaries between various peoples and empires. They carried with them not only material wealth, but also important political and cultural connections that allowed Persia to maintain its strength. Historians still debate how much influence merchants had on the overall political landscape of ancient empires. Some argue that merchants were simply secondary players who served the interests of the ruling elite, while others believe that they wielded a significant amount of power in their own right. While it is true that many merchants were wealthy and connected to the elite, they were often also subject to the whims of the rulers and their taxes, tariffs, and regulations. Regardless of their exact political power, however, the impact of merchants on ancient economies is undeniable. They created the economic infrastructure that allowed the great empires to thrive, and without them, the ancient world would have been a far less interconnected place. One quirky tidbit about ancient merchants is the role they played in the spread of religion. The movements of merchants across the Silk Road, for example, helped spread the teachings of Buddhism from India to China and Southeast Asia. Similarly, Jewish merchants facilitated the spread of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam across different parts of the ancient world. The merchants not only exchanged goods, but also ideas and religious practices, making them central to the cultural and spiritual history of the ancient world. Historians still argue whether merchants were primarily concerned with wealth, or whether they saw their work as part of a larger cultural mission. Were they simply traders seeking to make a profit, or were they in some cases bringing together different peoples and ideas, facilitating the spread of knowledge and culture across vast distances? Some historians argue that the very act of trading was seen as a form of diplomacy, and that merchants often served as bridges between different cultures, helping to foster peaceful relations between empires. Whether they were diplomats, business people, or simply travellers, the role of the merchant in ancient empires was undoubtedly critical to the success and sustainability of these civilizations. Merchants, like so many other workers in ancient civilizations, were rarely celebrated in history, and their names rarely appeared in grand historical records. Yet, without them, there would have been no exchange of goods or ideas, no flow of wealth to sustain the empires, and no connection between distant lands and peoples. They may not have wielded power or commanded armies, but their work was integral to the prosperity and continuity of ancient societies. Continuing on, let's now shift our focus to the tanners and leatherworkers, another group whose craft was essential but often overlooked in the grand scope of ancient empires. From the sandals worn by soldiers to the armour that protected the warriors, the leather goods produced by these artisans were indispensable to everyday life and warfare. They worked tirelessly to create the products that supported not only the physical needs of the empire, but also its military power, as leather was used for everything from armour to weaponry, tools, and even ceremonial garb. Imagine yourself in the bustling marketplace of ancient Rome or the workshop of an Egyptian craftsman. You're a leather worker, skilled in your trade, using tools passed down through generations. The smell of fresh tanned hides fills the air as you work your craft, fashioning a pair of sandals, a belt, or a piece of armour. Your work is essential. Soldiers depend on the armour you create to protect them on the battlefield, and merchants rely on leather goods to carry their wares across long distances. Leather, durable and versatile, is the backbone of both practical life and the empire's military might. In ancient Egypt, leather was used for a wide range of purposes. Sandals, belts, and straps were essential items, and the quality of the leather often indicated the social status of the wearer. The elite could afford finely crafted leather goods, often decorated with intricate patterns or gilded elements, while those of lower status had simpler functional items. Leather was also crucial in the military. The armour worn by Egyptian soldiers often incorporated leather as a primary material, as it was both flexible and durable, offering some protection against arrows and spears. The leatherworkers who created these goods were integral to the Egyptian military, ensuring that the soldiers were properly outfitted for battle. In ancient Rome, leather workers, or corium physes, were highly skilled artisans who supplied the empire's legions with essential items. Roman soldiers wore leather armour, known as lorica segmentata, which was made of strips of leather bound together with metal. This armour offered flexibility and durability, which made it suitable for the diverse conditions the Roman legions faced as they marched across vast territories. Leather workers were also responsible for crafting sandals, which were vital for Roman soldiers and civilians alike. The sandals, called caligae, were designed for long marches, with thick soles and open toes to prevent overheating during the heat of battle or on long journeys. These sandals became a symbol of the Roman military, and their durability contributed to the empire's expansion and success. The tanners who worked alongside leather workers played an equally important role. Tanning is the process of turning raw animal hides into durable leather, and it was a labour-intensive and specialised task. Tanners used a variety of natural materials such as tree bark, oils and fats to preserve the hides. In ancient Egypt, tanners worked in specialised workshops located outside the city due to the unpleasant odour associated with the tanning process. The hides would be soaked in vats and worked over several days until they were ready to be fashioned into goods by leather workers. In ancient Greece, leather was equally prized for its utility. The Greeks used leather for everything from shoes to shields, and it played a key role in warfare. Greek soldiers, known as hoplites, often carried shields made of leather, reinforced with wood and metal. The durability of leather made it a perfect material for defensive gear, which was essential for the success of Greek armies in battle. As in Rome and Egypt, the leather workers' craft was directly tied to the military power of the civilization, ensuring that soldiers were well equipped to defend the empire. In the Inca Empire, tanners and leather workers were also vital to the military and everyday life. While the Incas are better known for their sophisticated textiles and agricultural systems, leather played a significant role in the empire's success. The Incas used leather for armour, tools and even clothing, though their leather working techniques were not as advanced as those of the Egyptians or Romans. Leather was often used to create sandals, belts and harnesses for their llamas and alpacas, animals that were crucial to the Inca economy. The use of leather goods helped the Inca maintain control over their vast empire, particularly in the military and transportation sectors. Despite the crucial role of tanners and leather workers in these ancient societies, they were often not given the same recognition as the elite or the warriors. In some cultures, leather workers were considered lower status artisans, performing work that was seen as dirty or laborious. However, their craft was essential to the functioning of the empire. Without their work, soldiers would have lacked proper armour, citizens would have been without shoes, and the empire's trade routes would have been less effective. Historians still debate the social status of tanners and leather workers in ancient societies. Were they respected for their skills, or were they relegated to the lower ranks of society? Some scholars suggest that in civilizations like Egypt and Rome, where the military and elite had a significant presence, leather workers were seen as important artisans, while in other societies they were regarded as less prestigious. Regardless of their social standing, their contributions were undeniable. The leather goods they produced were integral to the success of the empire, from military conquest to daily life. An interesting tidbit about ancient leatherworking is the role of leather in trade. Leather goods were valuable commodities that were often traded across vast distances. In the Roman Empire, for example, leather goods like shoes, armour and saddles were exchanged between provinces. Leather was also an important trade good along the Silk Road, where it was used for everything from bags and boots to armour and furnishings. The ability to trade high-quality leather goods allowed empires to expand their influence and strengthen their economies. Historians still argue whether leather workers and tanners were conscious of the political and cultural significance of their craft. Were they simply artisans making products to meet demand? Or did they understand that their work was essential to the empire's military strength, economic success, and cultural identity? Some believe that leather workers were aware of the importance of their craft, while others suggest that they were simply fulfilling a practical need. Regardless of their understanding, their work was integral to the functioning of the empire. Whether they were crafting sandals for soldiers or armour for kings, leather workers were at the heart of ancient civilization. As we continue exploring the essential but often invisible workers of ancient empires, let's turn to a particularly controversial topic, the slave labour debate. Slavery was a pervasive institution in many ancient societies, from Egypt to Rome, and it is crucial to recognize that much of the infrastructure, economic systems, and even cultural practices were built upon the backs of enslaved individuals. While historians still debate the exact number of slaves and the extent of their labor, one thing is clear. Without them, the great empires of antiquity would not have functioned as they did. Imagine yourself in ancient Rome, or perhaps in the grand estates of Egypt or Greece. You are a slave, bound to serve the wealthy elites who control vast amounts of land, resources, and political power. Your day begins before dawn as you prepare to carry out the orders of your masters. Whether you're working in the fields, tending to the household, or performing labor-intensive tasks like mining or construction, your life is dictated by the needs and whims of your owners. The work is grueling and thankless, but it is essential to the functioning of the empire. Without your labor, the luxuries of the elite would not be possible, and the infrastructure of the empire would collapse. In ancient Egypt, slavery was an important part of the economy. While not all laborers were enslaved, many were. Slaves worked in agriculture, construction, and domestic service. The grand monuments of ancient Egypt, such as the pyramids, were built by the labor of thousands of workers, many of whom were slaves. However, it is worth noting that there was a distinction between forced labor and skilled workers in ancient Egypt. Some individuals, though working under difficult conditions, were employed on a temporary basis and were not technically slaves. Still, the use of slave labor, particularly in monumental building projects, is a point of historical debate, with some scholars arguing that slavery was not as widespread as commonly thought, while others maintain that it played a central role. In ancient Rome, slavery was far more institutionalized and pervasive. The Roman Empire relied heavily on slave labor in almost every aspect of its economy, from agriculture to mining to domestic work. Roman elites owned vast estates, worked by slaves who cultivated the land, harvested crops, and maintained the infrastructure. Slaves also worked in mines, where the conditions were often brutal and dangerous. Slavery was central to the functioning of the Roman economy, with enslaved individuals providing the labor necessary to fuel the empire's growth. Roman households, particularly those of the elite, were often staffed by numerous slaves, responsible for cooking, cleaning, childcare, and even tutoring the children of wealthy families. The Roman army itself also utilized slaves, particularly in auxiliary roles. In battle, slaves might carry supplies, tend to wounded soldiers, or serve in other non-combat positions. Interestingly, some slaves in the Roman Empire were even able to buy their freedom after years of service, though this was more of an exception than the rule. Despite this possibility for manumission, the majority of slaves in ancient Rome had little to no hope of ever gaining their freedom. In ancient Greece, slavery was similarly entrenched in society. Slaves were employed in a wide range of roles, including as domestic servants, agricultural labourers, and skilled artisans. The wealth of the Greek elites was, in large part, built on the labour of slaves. Some slaves were skilled craftsmen, working as potters, sculptors, or metal workers, while others worked the land or served in homes. Slaves in ancient Greece were typically considered property, with few, if any, legal rights. However, like in Rome, some slaves in Greece could earn their freedom, particularly if they were able to buy it or if their masters freed them for their service. One of the most interesting aspects of slavery in ancient Greece was its role in maintaining the political and social order. Greek city-states such as Athens and Sparta relied on slave labour to maintain their economic and military dominance. The citizens of Athens, for example, had the luxury of participating in democracy and intellectual pursuits, in part because slaves did the physical work of maintaining the city. Similarly, in Sparta, slaves known as helots were forced to work the land, while the Spartan citizens focused on military training and defence. Historians still argue about the moral and social implications of slavery in the ancient world. Were ancient societies more tolerant of slavery due to cultural norms, or were they simply economically dependent on the practice? Some scholars suggest that slavery was so ingrained in the social and economic systems of ancient civilizations that it was seen as a natural and necessary part of life. Others argue that the moral implications of slavery were debated within these societies, though any action to abolish or reform the system was rare. Ancient philosophers, such as Aristotle, justified slavery in their writings, seeing it as essential to the functioning of society, while others, such as Socrates, were more critical of it, though their influence was limited at the time. One quirky aspect of the slavery debate is the role of manumission, or the process by which slaves were granted freedom. In ancient Rome, for instance, some slaves who served their masters faithfully or performed exceptionally well were granted their freedom, often through a formal ceremony known as liberatio. This act of manumission was sometimes accompanied by a gift, such as a piece of land or money. In Egypt, though slaves did not have the same pathways to freedom, some were able to buy their release or were freed after serving for a set period of time. This process, though relatively rare, created a complex social structure in which some freed slaves could eventually rise to positions of wealth and influence despite their humble beginnings. While slavery in the ancient world is often viewed through a lens of exploitation, it's important to recognize the complex role it played in the development of ancient empires. Slaves were not just laborers, they were also a source of wealth, a crucial part of the social fabric and sometimes even active participants in the empire's expansion. Yet, despite their importance, slaves were rarely acknowledged as individuals. They were seen as tools, their contributions obscured by the narrative of the ruling elite. Historians still argue about the extent to which ancient societies understood the ethics of slavery. Were slaves viewed as mere property, or was there a recognition of their humanity and contributions? Some suggest that the Romans, Egyptians, and Greeks were too entrenched in their economic systems to question the practice, while others argue that there was a growing sense of moral unease with slavery, particularly as ideas about personal freedom and human rights began to emerge in later centuries. Regardless of the debates, it is clear that the system of slavery was a cornerstone of ancient economic systems, and its impact on society cannot be overlooked. As we continue our exploration of the invisible workers who sustained ancient empires, let's focus on another vital but often overlooked group, the technicians and engineers of warfare. These individuals, though not often celebrated in history books, played a crucial role in the success of ancient armies. They were the ones who designed, built and maintained the weapons and siege machines that allowed empires to expand their territories and protect their borders. Without them, the great military conquests of the ancient world would have been nearly impossible. Imagine yourself as an engineer or technician in the ancient world, working in a bustling workshop surrounded by tools, wood and metal. You are tasked with designing and constructing war machines, weapons and fortifications that will be used in battle. Whether it's the creation of catapults, ballistae or siege towers, your work will be central to the empire's military strategy. The work is demanding and dangerous, but the rewards are great. The military success of the empire depends on your ability to innovate and improve the tools of war. In ancient Rome, the role of engineers and technicians in warfare was especially significant. The Roman military was known for its organizational prowess, and the weapons and siege equipment used by Roman legions were a key part of that success. Roman engineers were responsible for designing and building a variety of siege machines, including onagers, a type of catapult, ballistae, giant crossbows, and siege towers used to breach enemy walls. These machines were incredibly advanced for their time, capable of hurling heavy projectiles over great distances or breaking down the walls of fortified cities. Roman military engineers also designed and constructed fortifications, including the famous Roman roads and military camps, which were essential for the movement of troops and the establishment of secure bases in conquered territories. The Roman military was renowned for its ability to build quickly and efficiently, and the engineers who worked with the legions played a key role in the empire's ability to maintain control over its vast territory. The castrum, a military camp, was meticulously planned, with roads, defensive walls and infrastructure that allowed soldiers to be stationed anywhere across the empire. In ancient Greece, military engineers also played an important role, particularly during the Peloponnesian War and in the conflicts between the Greek city-states. Greek engineers were responsible for building defensive walls, weapons and siege machines. The Greeks are often credited with inventing the first ballistae, a powerful weapon that could launch large projectiles with deadly accuracy. The design of these weapons, as well as the strategic use of siege towers and battering rams, allowed Greek armies to break through enemy fortifications and gain the upper hand in battles. One of the most famous engineers from ancient Greece was Archimedes, who designed a variety of war machines, including the claw of Archimedes, a device used to lift enemy ships out of the water and capsize them. Archimedes' innovations were integral to the defense of the Greek city-state of Syracuse against the Roman siege in 214–212 BCE. His inventions, though primarily designed for warfare, demonstrated the incredible skill and ingenuity of ancient engineers whose work would continue to influence military technology for centuries. In ancient Persia, military engineers were also highly valued for their ability to design and construct siege engines. The Persians used a variety of weapons in their battles, including large catapults and archery devices, which were essential for their military strategy. Persian engineers were responsible for building and maintaining these siege machines, ensuring that the army had the tools it needed to break through enemy lines or fortified cities. Additionally, Persian engineers were instrumental in designing and constructing defensive walls, such as those at Persepolis, which helped protect the empire from invaders. In the Inca Empire, engineers were vital not just in warfare but also in the construction of military roads and fortifications. The Incas built a vast network of roads that connected the empire, allowing soldiers to quickly mobilize across the mountainous terrain. These roads, often carved into the mountainsides, were a key part of the empire's military success, enabling them to maintain control over their territories and respond quickly to threats. Inca engineers also built impressive fortresses, such as the one at Sacsayhuaman, which helped defend the empire from invading forces. Historians still debate the extent to which these military engineers and technicians had a direct influence on the course of battles and wars. Were their innovations the sole reason for military success, or did their work simply complement the efforts of the generals and soldiers? Some argue that the advancements in weaponry and siege technology were crucial to the success of empires, while others suggest that the victories were more a result of strategic leadership, discipline, and sheer numbers. Regardless of the debate, one thing is clear: the contributions of these unseen workers were essential to the military dominance of ancient civilizations. One quirky tidbit about ancient warfare technology is the use of Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary weapon used by the Byzantine Empire. Greek fire was capable of burning even on water, making it a terrifying weapon in naval battles. The exact formula for Greek fire was a closely guarded secret, and historians still debate its composition. Some scholars believe that it was made from a mixture of oil, sulfur, and other ingredients, while others suggest that it was a form of early napalm. Regardless of its exact composition, Greek fire was a game-changer in naval warfare and one of the most fearsome weapons of its time. Historians also argue about the level of innovation and technical expertise required to build these weapons and machines. Were ancient military engineers simply following well-established designs, or were they constantly inventing new technologies? Some suggest that the innovations in ancient warfare technology were not as advanced as we might think, while others point to the sophistication of Roman and Greek siege machines, arguing that they were incredibly advanced for their time. What is certain is that these engineers, working behind the scenes, were responsible for creating the tools that enabled armies to conquer vast territories and defend empires from destruction. Though they often went unnoticed in the grand historical narrative, military engineers and technicians were indispensable to the success of ancient empires. They created the weapons, built the fortifications, and devised the strategies that allowed empires to thrive in the face of constant warfare. Without their ingenuity, the ancient world would have looked very different, less secure, less expansive, and far more vulnerable to attack. As we reach the final section of our journey through the invisible workers who sustained ancient empires, let's take a moment to reflect on one of the most foundational but uncelebrated groups, the herbalists and midwives. These skilled individuals may not have commanded armies or wielded political power, but their work was absolutely essential to the survival of ancient societies. Their knowledge of plants, remedies, and childbirth was critical for maintaining public health, ensuring the continuation of family lines, and even shaping the early medical practices that would evolve into modern medicine. Imagine yourself as an ancient herbalist, standing in your garden surrounded by a multitude of plants. You're steeped in knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge about which plants can heal, which ones can harm, and how to create remedies for everything from simple aches to deadly fevers. You've spent years perfecting your craft, and though you may not have the formal recognition of the physicians in the grand cities, your work is no less vital. The people in your village rely on your knowledge for their health and well-being, and your medicines are often the difference between life and death. In ancient Egypt, herbalists and healers were among the most respected members of society, even though their work often went unnoticed in the historical record. The Egyptians were pioneers in the field of medicine, and their knowledge of herbs and natural remedies was far ahead of its time. Ancient Egyptian medical texts, like the Ebers Papyrus, contained detailed instructions for the use of medicinal plants, from garlic, which was believed to promote strength and combat infections, to juniper berries, used to treat respiratory conditions. The ancient Egyptians had a rich understanding of the therapeutic properties of plants. Many of these herbal remedies were also used in religious rituals, linking the practice of healing with spiritual beliefs. In addition to herbalists, midwives were essential figures in ancient society. In ancient Greece and Rome, midwives played a central role in childbirth, a process fraught with danger in the ancient world. While some women gave birth with the assistance of their families or other women in the community, others relied on trained midwives to ensure a safe delivery. The role of the midwife was not just about physical assistance during childbirth, it was also about providing emotional support and offering wisdom passed down through generations. In ancient Greece, midwifery was considered an important profession, and women who became midwives were highly respected for their knowledge and skill. In ancient Rome, midwives had a unique role, often working alongside physicians to manage the medical aspects of childbirth. They had an understanding of both the physical and psychological aspects of pregnancy and childbirth, which made them essential in the Roman household. Midwives also served as the primary caregivers to infants, ensuring their survival in a time when infant mortality rates were high. The work of midwives extended beyond childbirth. They were often responsible for providing advice on infant care, nutrition, and hygiene, all of which contributed to the survival and health of the next generation. Herbalists and midwives in ancient civilizations were often women, and their work was integral to the day-to-day functioning of society. While male physicians might have been in charge of treating the elite or conducting surgery, it was the female herbalists and midwives who were often the first line of defense for everyday people. Their knowledge of plants, remedies, and childbirth helped ensure that families survived and thrived, particularly in times of illness, famine, or war. Historians still debate the exact role of women in ancient medicine and healing. Were herbalists and midwives truly recognized for their contributions, or were they relegated to the background of ancient medical practice? Some argue that women in ancient societies were seen as essential in the domestic sphere, especially in areas like childbirth and child-rearing, but their work in medicine was often overlooked in favour of male-dominated fields like surgery or high-level medical theory. Others point to the prominence of female healers in certain cultures, such as the role of women as shamans or priestesses in ancient Egypt or Greece, suggesting that female healers were more respected than we often think. One quirky tidbit about ancient midwifery is that midwives in ancient Rome used a variety of tools to assist in childbirth. Some of these tools were surprisingly advanced for the time, including instruments designed to help with difficult births, like forceps or spoons. These tools were not as sophisticated as modern medical instruments, but they were essential in assisting with childbirth in an era when medical intervention was limited. Another interesting fact about ancient herbalism is that the use of herbal remedies was not just for humans. In ancient Egypt, for example, animals were also treated with medicinal plants. The Egyptians had a wide range of remedies for animals, particularly for horses, which were essential to the military. Horses were given medicinal herbs to treat injuries and illnesses, ensuring that they remained fit for battle. The ancient Egyptians even used plants to treat their beloved cats, who were revered as sacred animals. The connection between animals and plant-based medicine shows how deeply ingrained herbalism was in all aspects of life. Historians still argue whether ancient herbalists and midwives had formal training, or whether their knowledge was passed down orally from generation to generation. Some scholars suggest that there were formalized schools of herbalism or midwifery, where women could receive specialized training in their craft, while others argue that the knowledge was passed down informally from mother to daughter, or through apprenticeships. Regardless of how they acquired their knowledge, one thing is certain: the work of herbalists and midwives was indispensable to the survival and well-being of ancient societies. While we may never know the full extent of their contributions, we can be certain that the herbalists and midwives of ancient empires were crucial to the fabric of daily life. They provided care and comfort to the people, ensured the survival of future generations, and laid the foundation for the medical practices that would eventually evolve into the modern field of medicine. Without them, the ancient world would have been a much harsher place, 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 a much harsher